So welcome everybody, and welcome to Peter, our guest speaker today. Very briefly, if there's anybody new to ASP, there's a very important historical link here because ASP was established by a group of alumni from the Responsible Business Practice MSc, and please correct me if I'm wrong because I wasn't there, that Peter helped create and run in Bath University with several people who are on this call. So RBP had its gestation in that period, and over the years we've kept it going. It's gone different directions, but in the last 18 months or so, we've had a strong input of RBP and AMSRA alumni who have really sort of brought a new life and vigor and sense of purpose to ASP, which we're all very grateful for. So if you're not already members of ASP, we'd love you to join. It's a community. It's an organism more than an organization, and we're just here to help to connect, challenge, and support people to learn how to move from unsustainable to sustainable practices. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Jagdish and Helena, who had the idea of creating the Earth Conversation series, for them to give a brief introduction to that.
Hi everyone, it's absolutely lovely to see you all, and it's very special, I think, today that we will be talking with Peter and talking about action research and cooperative inquiry. Just to say, the idea of Earth Conversations is to bring us all together to have a combination of speakers on inspiring topics, but then to follow with a cycle of themed on action research. So in a way, we're mirroring what was the responsibility in business practice and the AMSRA master's program, and we're bringing it to everybody because these sessions are free. We're very grateful Peter is here today, not charging us, so we can make them free and we can take the ideas out, and they will be on the website. I just wanted to say a little bit how special it is to have Peter here, because actually I did my first cooperative inquiry over 2 decades ago now, in 2000, in Schumacher College, where we actually did a cooperative inquiry to look at deep ecology. And that process stayed with me as an abiding, inspiring process. And here I am 2 decades later, and I'm very proud to be using cooperative inquiry with students here at Manchester Metropolitan University. So what I'd like to say is, Peter, a very big welcome, and also your journey. I think you're going to be talking about that journey with cooperative inquiry, and also how you're engaging with the living world. And I think that's such an important journey to share with us, and then that we can take out and share with others. So thank you, Peter, and I'll pass on to Jagdish.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you, Peter, for coming. Thank you, Gwen. And thank you all for being here this evening. So this is, I think, our 4th meeting as Earth Conversations. Gwen, am I right?
That's correct, yes.
And this started as such a hesitant idea in my head, and I was scared of even putting it across to the ASP board. And one day I just happened to casually, hesitantly, carefully mention it, and Helena picked it up, Gwen picked it up, and it's amazing how when you want to do something, it just falls into place. Ask for it, reach for it, and I think the world is more than willing to open many doorways for us. I still can't believe Peter Reason is with us here this evening. Peter, I've never met you, but my MSc at Ashridge wouldn't have been possible without you, without the handbook on action research that you have co-edited. And there's a passage from there that I really like. I would still like to read it. As we search for practical knowledge and liberating ways of knowing, working with people in their everyday lives, we can also see that action research is participative research, and all participative research must be action research. Human persons are agents who act in the world on the basis of their own sense-making. Human community involves mutual sense-making and collective action. Action research is therefore only possible with, for, and by persons and communities, ideally involving all stakeholders, and it goes on. And I can't tell you how much of an influence some of these words, these ideas, action research itself has had on me. I will say no more. I think the time is yours. I'm very keen to listen in, as are all of us, and I'd want to pick up this conversation later if we can. Over to you, Peter. When you'd like to make some remarks, or can Peter begin right away?
Just one point which I forgot was that Peter will have the floor for, well, as long as he likes, but we nominally said 45 minutes, and then there'll be an interactive Q&A which you can put questions in the chat or just raise a hand. We want it as an informal and as interactive as possible. So over to you, Peter. And Peter, would you like any questions during your talk, or would you prefer to wait till the end?
No, I'm very happy to respond to questions. Maybe I could tell some of the story to start with, but I don't think I'll talk for 45 minutes. I hope I won't. If I do, I've gone on too long. It's much more interesting to have a conversation than to spout, but I will spout, I promise.
Super. Over to you then, Peter.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation. Just by way of warm-up, when I first retired, if people asked me to do things like this, I would say things like, no, I don't do that anymore, which was quite a good way of stopping being an academic. And it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that I've come back to seeing the way I can use cooperative inquiry in new ways. And it's really interesting, you're reading, Jagesh, that quote from the handbook, because that is illustrating the very humanistic roots of action research and of cooperative inquiry, very much in humanistic psychology. I mean, cooperative inquiry started there. And that always produced a tension in my mind, because the whole idea of participation increasingly needed to go further than that. As Helena has pointed out, we began to experiment with that at Schumacher College. And so in a sense, the title of the chapter of the book that I've written recently for this is called, oh no, it doesn't have it there. Cooperative, yeah. That's not the title of the thing. I've got that wrong. The theme, in a sense, is from humanistic psychology to ecological inquiry, to take the idea from the contemporary animist, whose name I've forgotten. I always forget his name. The world is full of persons, only some of whom are human. So that's the direction of travel. But I was asked to talk about cooperative inquiry in its original right. So I'll start there and try to lead you fairly quickly through the process. And I'm sorry, some of you have heard this story before, but when I was doing my PhD, which was in 1975, 76, 75, I was wanting to study two-person relationships. And that gave me a particular problem, because as soon as you introduce another person into a two-person relationship, you no longer have a two-person relationship. And so there are all sorts of traditional questions of contamination and how did you get to grips with that. And I was struggling for quite a long time as to how to do this research, because I didn't see that any of the methods I'd been very well taught in my PhD, American PhD program. And so I was walking down at Elbert Street, which goes through the middle of the campus, and I could take you there, the place where my foot trod on a paving stone, and I suddenly realized that the answer to the dilemma was to stop seeing myself as a researcher of other people's two-person relationships, but to see them, the people in those relationships, as researchers of their own relationship. And that was an insight that has really directed the rest of my life, because what I did for my PhD was to set up I didn't call it a cooperative inquiry group. I wasn't using that terminology then, but we set up a workshop at which we invited all sorts of different people in relationship to come, and we designed this is my friend Marianne and I, a set of exercises and explorations to which were guided by my theory, so it wasn't entirely cooperative, which were enabled them to look at their relationship and renegotiate it or do whatever they wanted with it. And I wrote that up as a piece of qualitative research. So in some ways it was still very traditional. And then I came back to England and met, first of all, John Rowan, who was developing what he called the dialectical cycle of research, which is a very interesting way of talking about research, the way it moves from one to another to another. That's in the original Human Inquiry. I also met John Rowan, John Heron, and a whole lot of other people, and we formed the New Paradigm Research Group in London, wonderful over-the-top name, and wrote a New Paradigm Manifesto, which you can find on my website, which is dreadfully out of date, I think. And John Rowan and I co-edited Human Inquiry, which was dated 1981. I was one of those very lucky early academics. I mean, I was in my late 30s at this stage, I suppose, in that this book really hit the spot. So, you know, somebody said, what's his name, said it should be burned. I do apologize. I find it difficult to remember names these days, but Hans Eysenck said it should be burnt. And when I had an interview at the University of Bath for a promotion to senior lecturer, one of the senior professors described me as a heretic, a scientific heretic. But then on the other hand, Carl Rogers, who was celebrated humanistic psychologist, described as a goldmine of approaches to research. So, you know, for whatever reason, this book made a mark early in my career. So which I tried to capitalize on, not necessarily intentionally, but so there we are. So. And what I found when with the New Paradigm Research Group and with editing this book was that all over the planet there were people who were talking about collaborative forms of research in different kinds of ways. And it's not my job today to talk about that range, but you know, there were people, just to point to some people, there was Marilisa Swantz, a Finnish, originally missionary in Tanzania, developing participative action research. There was the, I freeze as soon as I start trying to remember names. Anisur Rahman in Bangladesh, and Orlando Falsborda in Colombia, doing a similar thing with a slightly different slant. There was Bill Torbert, who was developing action inquiry and collaborative research as a form of organization. It was all over the place. There was feminist action research. There was, then later there was appreciative inquiry or inquiry, which depends on which side of the pond you are. And so this movement was something that was really interesting and really important to draw together. But let's talk about cooperative inquiry quite specifically. It came out of humanistic education. It was John Heron's original coining, and the idea from a psychological point of view was that you couldn't study persons as persons unless you treated them as persons. And most psychological research didn't treat people as persons, it treated them as objects. And so if you wanted to do research, genuinely research with people, it has to be with people. It has to be with people because it's only in collaborative relationship that people are fully human, or at least potentially fully human. And so that's an interesting kind of thing when you think of the world being full of persons, not only some of whom are human. So we'll come to that later on. So the idea was, what kind of relationship would one have that gave participants in the inquiry process the opportunity to express themselves fully as humans? And that clearly meant that you couldn't have the traditional relationship where one person or one group of people were the researchers who are having all the ideas that went into the research and drawing the ideas that came out of the research, and another group of people who were just acting, and maybe acting without any sense of what the questions were. That obviously was only treating people as objects to be looked at. So the idea became, what happens if we invite everybody to be co-researchers and co-subjects? So everybody involved is both contributing to the ideas that will be researched, to the questions that will be looked at, will also be part of the action involved in the inquiry process and of the sense making that goes into it. So everybody is co-equal. And then of course you have the big debate about what do you mean by equal? Doesn't necessarily mean everybody's doing the same thing. You may have some people who have skills in different kinds of areas. So there's then becomes the whole negotiation of how do you create what Bill Talbot called a community of inquiry, and all the interpersonal and group dynamics of doing that, often within a context, whether it be an organization or an issue of race relations or a political move towards equality for women or whatever it might be, which was also having an impact on the relationships within the group. So that's about one side of the inquiry process. And then another aspect of it was, well, what is the nature of knowing when one's involved in this kind of cooperative process? And John originally, and John did a lot of the original formulation of this. John originally talked about an extended epistemology, which started in experiential knowing and moved to practical knowing, and out of that practical knowing. And we did some early inquiries into co-counselling, and we realized that there was another whole stage to it, which was presentational knowing. And so the extended epistemology became a fourfold process of experience. I'll talk about these in more detail in a minute, but I'll just sketch it out. Experiential knowing, which is knowing through touching, through being involved, through being present. Presentational knowing, which is the first kind of way we clothe that in some kind of narrative, but it can also be a work of art or a work of poetry or something like that. Propositional knowing, which is the knowing through ideas and theory, and practical knowing. And of course, because we're talking about an action research, and because we're talking about a practice that involves people engaging in inquiry into their own lives, there is a primacy of the practical. This is an action research, and the practical in this sense is the point of it. And if you look around in the many different forms of action research, people want to do things better. People want to do whatever better means, and that becomes another judgment. So many strands to pick up. That sense of judgment is really important because people often say, oh, Peter, you've got this action research methodology. And increasingly, I became really uncomfortable with this idea of methodology, because methodology is something that you apply to objects, really. And also because, and there's a whole other line I could go into, but I won't just now. The scientific revolution took knowing away from the human person or the human community and put it into methodology. So you get the double-blind crossover trial, which eliminates human judgment. Then when we go back into any form of action research, the judgment about how we're going to do this, what are we going to do, what are we going to do next, what are the important things, becomes paramount. And so all these forms of action research return that process of knowing back to the participant inquirers, and that becomes yet another layer of complexity to the whole business. It's not an easy business doing action research, as somebody pointed to me on cooperative inquiry when I finished my PhD. There are a lot easier ways to do a PhD than this, Peter, although I didn't think it was that bad. So we have this 4 ways of knowing, and the other thing about all forms of action research is that they're iterative. Again, if you look at traditional forms of research, they tend to be straight line. They tend to move from hypothesis to da-di-da-di-da to some sort of truth, some sort of knowing, some sort of result. Whereas cooperative inquiry moves through iteratively through cycles of action and reflection, or from experiential inquiry, experiential knowing, which is about being there, being deeply involved in it. Experiential knowing is often pre-verbal. It is about this experience of being here, being in this situation. It's deeply rooted in the body and in the sense, and also in imagination, probably. And then out of that, we start telling stories. We start telling stories of our experience, or we may actually write or compose something which articulates that more fully. And that is the realm of presentational knowing. And out of that process, or maybe missing some of the presentational stuff, we then start to build theories about what it is that we're doing. We build new theories, new ideas, and out of that, we act differently. It's really important that those links are made, because in traditional research, that extended epistemology is essentially broken. There is no link to experience, no direct link to experience, and often there is no link to practice. The ideas are produced for their own sake. And as my current colleague Freya Matthews points out, once one starts to privilege theoretical knowing in some ways, you create a separate world which may have nothing to do with the real world, whatever that may be. So we have a situation in which, well, let me give an example, as just because it grounds it a little bit. Kate McArdle. It's a nice simple. It's a relatively easy to tell the story of. Judy's sitting there. Hello, Judy. Judy and I were teaching undergraduates, and we realized that one of the things that was happening when we got these young people coming back from placement is that we were producing a lot of really bright young women who were going out into organizations that were essentially male dominated. I think this is a fair version of it. So we managed to get some money for a studentship, for a PhD studentship, to look at the experience of young women in essentially male-dominated organizations. And Kate McArdle was just finishing her degree at the university and jumped at the opportunity of doing this, and learned how to do cooperative inquiry through a number of exercises and axes. Not without some challenges, of course. And she set up an inquiry group in is it Procter and Gamble? Yes, it was Procter and Gamble. She set up an inquiry group. The organization got a prize for what they rather strangely called sex at work. It didn't mean sex at work, it meant gender relations at work. And they wanted a repeat of this. So they wanted something nice that they could tell. So Kate was drawn in, was invited in, and established through quite a lot of intimate talking to people about what it meant to be a young woman in a management, and what it meant to set up a cooperative inquiry. She established a cooperative inquiry group of about a dozen people, and was actually funded to do this, which was great. And they were all allowed to do this within work times. It was quite an interesting opportunity. And they engaged in cycles of action and reflection starting off by saying, well, what does it mean to be a young woman in this organization? We hadn't thought of ourselves as women, really, you know, sort of there's a consciousness raising that starts. And as soon as they go out into their first kind of experiential cycle, they begin to see the kinds of things that are expected of them or are happen to them as women. So they get called petal rather than by their name. They have to think every morning about what they're going to dress in ways that young men don't have to. There are exclusions. There are all sorts of strange things going on, and they begin to develop a body of practical experiential knowing, which they share with each other. They tell each other stories and go through several cycles of that, and then they begin to make sense of this. One of the sense making was, this would be the propositional knowing, this young woman who kept coming back saying she couldn't manage this meeting and she thought she was a failure because she couldn't do it and she wasn't, so on and so forth. And the manager puts his feet up on the desk while she's giving this presentation and walks out in the middle. And she's really distressed about this and she thinks it's her fault. She thinks she's not making a good enough presentation and she's introverting all that until one of the other women said, it's not your fault, you're being bullied. And so there's a use of an idea which shifts the whole process. It's a very grounded idea in experience, in the experiential knowing and the stories, but it also has consequences for what you do about it, because if you're being bullied rather than incompetent, it shifts what you do. And so, cut a long story short, it's all in the thesis, at least a lot of it is, she began to experiment after some resistance. She began to experiment with different ways of behaving in relation to this manager. So instead of feeling shy and upset and incompetent, she started to go up to him in the morning and said, "Good morning, Joe," or whatever his name was. "Good morning, Alan." And when she had a presentation to do, she went to him beforehand and asked for his suggestions and help. So you know, you could say she shouldn't have needed to do that. And of course, she shouldn't have needed to do that because the organization should have been looking after her better. But nevertheless, she did do that, form of leaning in, I suppose, and shifted that whole relationship. So you've got a group of people going through cycles of inquiry. I'm telling the easy bits of it. It wasn't straightforward. There were difficulties in the group. There were people who left, you know. Kate all this time was learning how to, at early 20s, to be a facilitator. But you've got the cycles of inquiry going through the different levels of response. And what happened was that they actually took this out beyond the cooperative inquiry because this group of young women decided that they really ought to be influencing the organization. And so they set up a bigger meeting, which I won't go into in detail now, and they invited some of the very few senior women. There was there's junior women and very senior women in the organization. There's very few in the middle. And they invited these senior women to come and meet other young women and held a dialogue and got involved in some sense with gender policies within the organization. So it's a really interesting piece of work along these kind of lines. So there's an awful lot one could say in addition to all that. Other examples, just to pick it, John and I did a very early example where we got a very early project when John was working for the British Postgraduate Medical Federation, and there was a lot of talk about holistic medicine, and we invited about 16 GPs, general practitioners, to join a cooperative inquiry group. We did quite a lot of negotiation early on about the form of it. And we went through 6 cycles of action and reflection. We had 2-day weekend meetings. And then they would go back for a period of about a month to their practice to put that into effect. And we developed a 5-part model of action of holistic medicine, and people experimented in different ways of doing that. And that was very interesting because it influenced the development of the British Holistic Medical Association, which was aimed to move holistic medicine forward. And then later there was another project at the Marylebone Health Centre, which was funded equally funded, and I was employed for a while to direct another cooperative inquiry into collaboration between medical and complementary practitioners, which there's a write-up of on my website. Another example which was really interesting, and again is on well, lots of examples. There was Sarah, and what was her colleague's name, did an inquiry with a whole range of different professionals in child protection, police, teachers, social workers, the whole lot, into how could they improve child protection by better collaborating with each other. Carlos Douglas was researching Black British woman, very active as a consultant in organizations around equal opportunities. She did her PhD around the question, how do I as a Black woman not just survive, but actively thrive in British organizations? And she set up a cooperative inquiry after a lot of personal work where they addressed that question. And that was really interesting. That was very challenging. I found it particularly interesting from a sort of reflection point of view, because I imagined that when I heard this, that this was going to be great. You know, the sisters were going to get together, and I had this sort of naive white man's image of what would happen when a group of Black women got together and sorted the world out. And it turned out that the inquiry was absolutely horrible. And Carlos has again written this up, because what they were confronting by this question of surviving rather than thriving was the whole culture of Black womanhood, if you could say that many of them had learnt on their mother's knees that their job was not to thrive, but to just get on with it and to support and to be servants to the whole process. And to start questioning that was something that was really upsetting, and there was a lot of distress in the group that they didn't find it easy to recognize. And I suppose that leads to say something about if we return the process of knowing to the human community, we have then to guard against or use or attend to all those ways in which human beings are fallible in their knowing process. I mean, that's why we invented the scientific method, was to cut the human out with all their, all their crazinesses and all their prejudices and their anxieties and stuff like that. But if you put the human center back again, you have to start attending to those kind of questions. And there's two fundamental things. One is the distress caused by inquiring into something. If you start inquiring into something genuinely that is of important to you, like how do I survive rather than thrive, it throws up all kinds of anxieties that one is then likely as an individual or as a group to act out. And so often inquiries need to attend to the distress that is raised through the inquiry process. And the other thing, of course, is that we can band together with what we called consensus collusion back in the 1980s. We band together in defense as to what might be actually happening. We collude together. And so there's all sorts of ways in which one can address those kinds of things, but the essence of it is to form an inquiry group which is critical, which is supportive, which is critical, which is able to really look through things carefully, through ideas carefully, look through experience carefully, can challenge its members both positively and negatively, if you like, but both to see the power of what they can create, but also to notice their all sense of illusion. How am I doing? Is this all right? Yeah? Yeah, okay.
Thumbs up, I think, there, Peter.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So let me then turn, that's the method. That's the method. I use the dreadful term. That's the process. And it has to be adapted. It has to be played with. I mean, I used to say to people when they were doing PhDs, you have to adapt the action research practices that people talk about to what you're doing and to you. It's not a question of picking a methodology off the shelf and doing it. So every cooperative inquiry, the setting up of it has a set of judgments on each individual person who's initiating it, or a small group is initiating it. And then there are judgments all the way through about how are we going to, where are we going to put our attention? Are we going to put our attention on being, systematically looking at the same thing time and time again, or are we going to be looser than that? All sorts of questions arise that need judgment in order to respond to them. There are no straightforward answers. But let me just carry on, because we can debate these in conversation. How am I doing? Oh God, I'm going to go on too long. If you stop treating people as objects of your inquiry as a researcher, and if you join with them in collaborative process, what you've done is you cut the difference between subject and object, which is the foundation of Western knowledge, as far as I can see. The Cartesian idea of cogito ergo sum, and separating the knowing subject from the object out there. And we could go on about dualism in Western society at very great length. But what you start pointing towards is what I called originally a participative worldview. And again, there's an enormous amount of stuff going on about how the world is not a set of things out there. I mean, since we were doing this early back in the 1980s, a whole range of new different ideas about new materialism and actor networks and all this kind of stuff, which much of it is quite beyond me because I haven't been keeping up with it. But we need to move towards a worldview that sees the world not as a set of things out there, but as a set of relationships. And this can be described in different ways. And things are not discrete things, and people and humans and animals are not discrete animals. They're symbionts, in the words of Donna Haraway. We're all symbionts. We're full. We as individuals are more than half other kinds of creatures, the bacteria that make us work. And so you have to start thinking in a different kind of way. And so that was the other side of the work we tried to do, was to develop this sense of a participative worldview on what does that mean, and how do you do that? And I talked about new paradigms and all sorts of stuff like that. So I'm going to leap forward now. Because, as I say, there was all that action, all that work, and then through all sorts of political processes, both the action research doctoral program and also the MSc got knocked on the head just before I retired, after Judy was no longer to make sure it didn't get knocked on the head. She and I had a wonderful double act going, which I couldn't maintain on my own. It was a very ugly political process, as I reflect on it now, but that's another side. So I stopped doing all that stuff. I decided I was going to be a nature writer, and I went and did a master's in creative writing and started trying to think, well, how do I take these ideas of a participative worldview and see that in relation to the world? Because by this time, the ecological catastrophe was evident to anybody who'd been on the MSc. It hurts me deeply that the kind of things that people are talking about publicly, we were talking about at the turn of the century, if not before. It's really, really, really upsetting. Anyway, so among other things, I went on 2 long sailing voyages, pilgrimages, where I was looking to understand my relationship to the natural world as a participative process. And there's nothing better than dealing with a gale at sea to give you a sense of modesty and how one has to be with the world rather than against it in that kind of way. And then I got to be 70 and couldn't carry on doing this single-handed sailing that was really quite demanding. And so I stopped doing that. And I'm trying to remember how the next stage happened, but I had been, I was teaching at California. Yeah, I was teaching in California, the California Institute of Integral Studies, and really teaching a participative worldview. And I drew a lot on my now colleague, Freya Matthews. So Freya is a panpsychic philosopher. And panpsychic philosophy really is a nice way of articulating the sense of participation. And I wrote a fan letter to her. I thought, I've been doing this. So I wrote this long letter appreciating her work, and I got no reply for months. And then I got this wonderful reply saying, terribly sorry, I put your email somewhere so as I could reply to it properly, and then forgot all about it, and it's slipped to the bottom. And we started a correspondence and she read my book and said, yeah, I can see what you're talking about merging with the natural world, becoming at one with the world. In the examples you're talking about from that inquiry, the sense that there isn't a boundary or how the boundary can disappear. But actually, I'm more interested in something else. I'm interested in the way the world responds to us under certain circumstances. If we evoke a world that is alive, that is living, that is sentient, that is a world that that will answer our call. We could, our invocation, if you like, which is one of the words she uses, will call forth a response from the world. And of course, I got terribly excited about this and began to read her work more carefully and more deeply. And together with Andreas Weber, who is a biopoetics biologist, we started to talk together. And so let me just shoot off a little bit into panpsychic thinking. I might need to just have some notes here. Not those notes. These notes. So what we were pushing against with cooperative inquiry, this materialist worldview that tells us the world is made of separate things, objects of nature, inert matter, operating according to causal laws. I mean, this is all in Human Inquiry and in the handbook. The world that has no subjectivity, no consciousness, no intelligence, no intrinsic purpose, no value or meaning in itself. Mind and physical reality are separate, and humans, this is the twist, humans and humans alone have the capacity for rational thought and action. So that's a disenchantment of the world, and arguably we could say this has caused or is at root of some of the challenges that we've got ecologically. Now, Freya's argument is that the presuppositions we bring to the world act as a sort of invocation. They call up a reality in a particular way. And so what would happen if we called up a different kind of reality? And in a panpsychic perspective, pan meaning everywhere is psyche, not necessarily psyche as we understand it, but that sense of sentience, that sense of interiority, of value for itself. So in a panpsychic perspective, this notion of sentience and the will to self-realization is a fundamental aspect of matter, just as matter is a fundamental aspect of mind. These two things go together. Mind and matter from the beginning, and that's why it's called cosmic panpsychism, cosmic living cosmos panpsychism. From the beginning, mind and matter are twin sides of the same reality, very close to the way Thomas Berry talks about it too. So Freya suggests that as a way of thinking, instead of thinking of the world as made up of lots of little bits that come together, and maybe somehow they come together in consciousness, which is the argument from a lot of the consciousness studies around at the moment, the cosmos as such is one. It's a coherent field of mind and matter from the beginning, from the start, whenever that was. And in its evolution, in its sense of becoming fully itself, this one differentiates into many, and the many are self-realizing and self-reflexive beings. So all things, including Earth, are integral to this living cosmos. We're all built out of this mind-matter togetherness. And the empirical world that we see in classical physics is the outward appearance of a subjective presence. Now, you need to read this in some detail to catch the arguments. But if all these, the cosmos as a whole and the selves which are spawned out of it, if you like, that's you and me and everything else, we are temporary, self-realizing and self-reflexive beings. And as such, we reach out to other beings in communication. So the world is also a communication. It's a subjective presence, but it's in communication, reaching out to other beings in different ways. A poetic ecology, if you like. And indeed, the theory would suggest that the cosmos itself, the world itself, is actively wanting to respond to us. The world is not there as a dead matter, but it is a reciprocal presence that has not only just the capacity, but wishes to answer back to us. The world becomes a place of enchantment, and its subjectivity becomes responsive in some way to human invocation. So we bring forth a world in this worldview that refuses to be reduced to objects, but is laden with meaning and laden with communication. And of course, it doesn't speak to us in human language. It speaks to us in what Freya calls a language of things and a materiality. It gestures to us, if you like. So this is a nice articulation of what I was struggling for all my life to talk about participation. And what happened to me, there's obviously very linked with animism and with, Freya's learnt a lot from the Aboriginal people. There's an awful lot of learning going on from Aboriginal talk. And somebody else, Sandra Wooltorton, who works with Aboriginal people in the west of Australia, got in touch with me with a paper she'd written about cooperative inquiry, where over a long period of time they'd been doing cooperative inquiry with Aboriginal people and white people around how do we understand our relationship with country, this idea of country that is within the Aboriginal worldview, which is a holistic concept. And I could elaborate on that a bit, but suddenly I had this idea that cooperative inquiry would be a wonderful way of exploring this process of panpsychic worldview. We could use cooperative inquiry in order to understand and develop the practice of invocation of a different kind of living world. So instead of saying, taking it as a theory, because, as I said earlier, Freya is very careful about saying, well, theory isn't the point. The point is to live with the world. So I got very excited about that. And so that was the process that I've been working on in the last 3-4 years. We've done 4 substantial cooperative inquiry processes in which we focused on the idea of rivers. There's all sorts of reasons for that. And we've invited people to join us in a cooperative inquiry process. And the very simple rubric has been that we will visit a local river and we'll check out with the river that it's happy to work with us. And we will invoke that river as a living sentient process, as a living sentient being, or a symbiosis of sentient presence. And we will do a range of things depending on people's comfort with different kinds of things. Maybe just sitting with the river, maybe doing ceremony, maybe getting inside and swimming in it, all sorts of different kinds of things to evoke that living presence and notice what we feel and what happens in response to that. And to join together with, because the first time we were going to do this at Schumacher College, and we got knocked on the head by, oh, you were going to come, weren't you, Helena? We got knocked on the head by COVID. And so a number of things happened, and we began to experiment with doing it online. Jacqueline Curio and I, who was a student at CIS, did one together, which we published as a journal article on voicing rivers. And we realized that we could do it really well on Zoom. Because what happens on Zoom is if you agree people will write something between each cycle, and then you record and transcribe, get Otter to transcribe the transcript for you, you've got a vast amount of what we traditionally used to call data or evidence or narrative, which you can then look at together and make sense of. One of the problems of cooperative inquiry is all that negotiation of, well, who's going to do the transcribing and stuff like that. But somehow when you use the technology, it all happens automatically. Not automatically, but it happens more simply. So, so that's what we've been doing. And I was going to read you a story, but I see there's two questions in the, probably questions, are there questions in the chat? Right, are there more observations, I think. So how are we doing? I could tell you a little story about what has come out of that for me. Shall I do that and then go open into questions? The one I was
Yes, I think that would be nice, actually, Peter.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, let me find something that I've written. I was going to read you something, but it's too long. Too long. Too long. I think this is shorter. Oh, it's still quite long. I'll tell it as a story rather than read it. So I had this idea. I found a spot where the River Frome runs into the River Avon, and it's in Freshford, which is one of these dormitory villages for very, very posh little village, and a pub. And there's a field that lots of people walk their dogs across, and so I got to go into this, and there's a narrow peninsula of land. It's no more than a metre apart where I sit on it with the rivers on each side of me. And I go there, I've been going there round about dawn. And during this process, I was obviously going once a week because that was the agreement with the other human participants. Now, I got into the idea of offering the river water as a kind of a symbolic gift. One of the things I realized as we did this is that the point of ceremony is whatever it is, but one of the things ceremony does is incline your mind into a different kind of way. It takes you out of the everyday objective world. You start to culture your own mind in a different way. So I took this water down. I think it was water from the River Thames that I picked up on a family visit to Marlow a couple of days beforehand, and so I offered this water. Obviously, I've been sitting there for quite a long time. Each visit would take a couple of hours, and I had my tea and breakfast, and I'd offer some to the river, talk to the river, notice what was going on. But the key thing that happened this first time was that I offered the water. I poured the water in and watched the sunlight sparkle through the twisting strands of water as it came out of the bottom, and watched it swept away by the current of the river. And as I looked down to the railway bridge, which is a little bit further down, I saw this movement, and there's just as I was doing this, and this is the point, you know, the feeling that the world is responding to something that you have done. And there were two swans coming up the river towards me. Big swans, big grown-up swans, the local swans. And they came sort of line ahead, one in front of the other, towards me, paddling quite fast. And they're quite alarming swans when they do this. And, you know, I'm sitting right there on the bank, and I can't move as quickly as I could when I was 20. So, you know, sort of slight degree of anxiety as they got closer and closer. And then they split, and one swam up the Avon and the other swam up the Froome. And it was like a choreographed movement in my mind. It felt quite clear to me in that time that that was a response to my call. I don't know what it means. I don't care particularly what it means, but it touched me in a way that, you know, obviously you have to bring the critical senses towards it, but the touching of me was really important. And so that was one experience that I had quite a while ago now, that suggested to me, that confirmed to me that if you call to the world does respond in some kind of way. It shows you that it is a sentient practice, it is a sentient being rather than just an object out there. That's one of many examples that I've had and other people have had. Some of them are less clearly so, and of course, in a sense, you have, if you want to be skeptical about it, you can dismiss it very easily. But if you enter into that worldview and you enter into that sense, you begin to say, well, it's just as crazy to think of the world as a set of inert things as it is to think of it as a sentient process. So that's what we've been doing, and I know some of you have been involved in that, and I appreciate your engagement with that. And so this is taking, if you like, that shift from the purely humanistic vision that we quoted earlier on, Jagnish, towards a sense of how would one work with a community which included other than human persons. How could you see cooperative inquiry as a process that engaged the world, that invoked the world as a sentient process? And talk about anxiety. You know, it's not. You know, sometimes I'm quite happy when people say, "What are you into?" I go and say, "Well, I'm talking to the river." And other times it feels like they'll think I'm nuts. So I don't know whether you think I'm nuts or not. So I leave it there. So that's enough talking. Probably too much. Sorry. Do you have questions? Oh, somebody said there's a couple of love the ideas of humans as symbionts. Elizabeth. Totally concurs with indigenous philosophies of Earth and the human. Yes, obviously there's a huge amount of, I mean, my colleagues in Sandra and Freya are both hugely influenced by by the really important work with Aboriginal people. Deborah Bird Rose was one of their friends, an extraordinary anthropologist, working very closely and publishing with, talk about participative research, publishing with the Aboriginal people rather than about them. So yes, the term symbiont comes from Donna Haraway's work, Staying with the Trouble, which I find an impossible book to read, but it's a nice idea. Would I mind sharing what you've observed in your pilgrimage with nature? Well, let me tell you another little story. we went to Orkney. Why did we go to Orkney? Oh, we went to Scotland, and my wife and I went to Scotland. We thought we're going to Scotland. We just take this opportunity to go to Orkney. And she was wanting to draw, so she was spending her time with her sketchbook one day at a little beach, and I was watching the tide come in, endlessly watching the tide come in, and watching the children, little skinny children, running around in the waves and getting cold. There was a very sense of people being there and the world being there, and I was watching this. These little bits of thrift, you know, the flower thrift, a little purple, delicate flower that is on the coast in these countries. And I decided I wanted to take a photograph of this thrift, and I was very concerned about whether to get the thrift in focus and the sea out of focus, or, you know, I got really into the technology of how I was going to do this, and it took me deeply into some sort of state of meditation, because I was just playing with it in different kind of ways, not thinking of anything else. And I must have been doing that for about 20 minutes or so, and Elizabeth was over there drawing, and I was watching the kids. And when I stood up, having finished this thing, this practice of, I suddenly felt for a fraction of a second that the world was one dancing whole. So there's that sudden realization that this isn't just a set of objects, the world is dancing. So that was one, different times in which my sense of being separate from the world faded away, and one becomes, in a bigger sense, part of it. Sometimes in situations from a sailing point of view that were completely dead calm. So I was out in the middle of the Minch and got becalmed, and there was no wind at all, and I had all the sails up, which is a hell of a fuss to do, but they all sort of flopped. And you think, well, what am I going to do? I think I'll just sit here. And this whole sense of silverness came over the world with the sort of misty brightness. And again, that sense of being a separate person moved away. So those kinds of things were happening on the inquiry. Bob, what are you saying? Fascinating thought. I'm being called away. Oh, you're being called away by other symbionts. Sorry, you're not there. So there. What there's an awful lot we could talk about. Do push your questions. Can you, Gwyn? Can you manage questions?
Technically, the meeting's finished, but that's
I've
only on.
gone too long.
No, not at all. I think everyone's here and quite happy to be here. We're not slaves to the clock. People can leave if they wish to, but I think people are, enjoying the conversation and want to continue. So
long, but I have.
We can stay as long as people want to stay. That's so we're pleased to hear. So please, people, either raise a hand or maybe submit a question through the Q&A through the chat. But feel free to join in now.
But also, I mean, Gerard, you were involved in the inquiry. It'd be interesting to know if you've got any observations. And somebody, Jean was, but Jean's gone off.
Yes, I'm happy to speak.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know your perspective on that.
Gosh, I'm surrounded by so many. I think the thing that amazed me is how people didn't think I was mad. And I chose my river. I had a big adventure at the first, big idea to go and visit the source of the my local river, which was going to be something like a 12-hour expedition. And then it was explained that we were going to have to do this every week, and realized that something a bit more manageable was probably my local nature park. And I hadn't quite thought about all the dog walkers, and that I was going to be potentially performing, and I was quite self-conscious. But it was just really interesting how when I did talk to people about it, they were really curious, genuinely, I believe, interested, and the word they all used was spiritual. There was no laughter, and that was very interesting. So that was my sense of my own perhaps barriers to it. And then I think what was particularly interesting was hearing the patterns that came across. And I wanted to ask you, Peter, now that you've started to process from those, I didn't realize there were so many cycles of cycles. What patterns have you begun to see?
Yeah, we've written a chapter where we talk about there's senses in which people just start noticing more and just feel the movement between them and the world is shifting. That's a sort of if you like, a first stage. There's a stage in which strange things happen, which are inexplicable. And then I think there's a this isn't a level thing, but then some people start to hear the river talking to them. There's very clear conversations they have in language, and I think that's best understood through the notions of psyche, the river stimulating psyche and hearing speech. But then there are very clearly quite dramatic episodes in which, and some of them go on for quite a long time, in which there is a pattern of response from the world, which is unmistakably connected. We're also picking up the notion of paying attention to synchronicities. Synchronicities happen within a group process. So one of the groups I was involved in, the first visit that Kathleen was going to make to her river, she heard this crunch, this is in North Carolina, under her tire, and she had run over a turtle. And so she's going out to talk to the river, and she'd run over a turtle, and this poor creature was crushed but still alive. She was devastated. She's a conservation biologist. So this is her work is other than that. And so there's this drama, and she takes the turtle and puts it in the river as some way of responding to it. But then Ezekiel, when she comes to tell this story, Ezekiel saw a turtle that had been run over on his work the other day, and that sense of the two things happening in the same cycle of inquiry makes you sit up. Just to finish the story, it's a long account, but Kathleen then went off to the East Caicos, the Caicos, and what are they called? The islands where she does her conservation research, counting turtles. And she found a baby turtle that hadn't got out of its nest, and was able to rescue it and return it in appropriate ways to the ocean, which it hadn't been able to get to. So there was a sense of a atonement for the original damage. And of course, the North America is known as Turtle Island in Native American mythology. And somebody said, well, the weight of our interventions is too much for the turtle's back. There's all sorts of images that crept around with that. So yeah, so we're still trying to draw all that together. Gerard, I've lost you on the screen.
I do have an observation, but I just noticed that someone else has popped a question in.
Right.
So I don't want to dominate, but I had a thought that I'd share. Does someone want to do the question?
They try to box it. Sorry, Jan, is it? Could you just say what the question is or what the point is? Where are you?
Hello, I'm here.
Oh, there. Hi.
Hi.
Go ahead. What your question is?
So the course is experiential, where the students go out into nature with certain invitations, similar to what you're describing, actually, and then they come back and share it with the group. And I'm really happy to work with researchers because I think this is such important work for us all to understand and for it to come out into all different spheres of life. Yet, I find that when I speak to researchers, they're objectifying it. I kind of said, yes, you can do this as long as you take part. You've got to be part of this. But they kind of close down there. It's like for them that's a problem, because then that's making it messy. And I feel the very people who should be doing it is them, because they're studying this, they're forming the questions. that the very question has been set by them, but if they've never connected with nature, how can they study nature connection? This is where I'm kind of like, so I just wonder if you've got any, I'm really excited by what you've said. I think it's really beautiful. You've touched me a lot. I wonder if you've got any tips about how we could work in the way that you're talking about.
Well, I think that having a theory of cooperative inquiry, a theory of epistemology, may be one way into that kind of thing. Because I remember when I was learning about biofeedback from two American experts in biofeedback, and they gave a long explanation of why it worked. And this was to the holistic doctors. And we said, why did you give that long lecture to begin with? Why don't you just get us straight in? And they said, well, because we've discovered that giving a long lecture in scientific terms puts the rational mind to sleep, and people are then more open to the experience. So there's something about having a philosophy, having a methodology which says, oh no, try this out, which bypasses or may bypass some of those kinds of questions. Let me put it this way. I'm just concerned about confidentiality. I know somebody. I know somebody who's been involved in a piece of research around oak dieback in the country, and it's a funded piece of work. And her work has been to do the research from the point of view of the oak trees, or bring the point of view of the oak tree. And this is a group of scientists that, all sorts of different kinds of science. You know how the research councils bring people together from different disciplines, and they have this big project that is quite unwieldy. So she took them out into the country and got them to think about what this research looked like from the point of view of the oak tree, and they were all very happy to do that. There is also a book by and I've forgotten the name again, on cooperative inquiry with other than human persons. So there's quite a lot of this work around at the moment. And the first paper we wrote is actually I have to laugh, in a top-ranked journal. We put together a special issue of the engineering journal, River Research and Applications, which basically is all about dams and stuff like that. But this is all about relating with rivers. So I think maybe clearly putting it as an exploration of a different point of view may be a way of stopping the rational mind. But then I would also say, never work uphill. One of the rules of change agentry, if they don't want to do it, work with some people who do, because you can put an awful lot of energy into convincing people who are never going to be convinced. And old paradigms don't die, they just fade away with the old people dying. So I don't know whether that's helpful, but those are my kind of thoughts about your question. Lovely question. Yeah. Social presencing theatre. Sophia?
Hello, yes. In response to what Jan was asking, one of the ways that I've found working with people to help them engage in something that obviously they are interested, because they are their intention is to observe nature, but not wanting to be a part of it on a mental level, where people they get embarrassed, people become self-conscious. And so playing games, literally, and with the physical body. Social presencing theatre is, I'm sure most of you know, designed by Aruana Hayashi and Otto Scharmer. She's been 30 years using movement and the body to be able to open up the space, read between the lines, help people to get out of the head, back into the body, connected with the earth, grounded, and having very different types of conversations by just using simple practices at the beginning of a meeting. You know,
all that very clearly helps, and giving some people some very simple things to do to start with. So, I mean, just like going out and giving loving attention is a very good starting place for that kind of work. Yeah, thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.
Right.
Lena.
Yeah, I just wanted to add two things, Peter. One, I did the Living Waters workshop, and I couldn't get to a river. Being in the inner city, I just didn't feel the same affinity. But I actually used our pond, and I observed the tadpoles, and we put them, because the year before they had died, we put them in a little maternity, a separate one, and we fed them frozen spinach, and they lived. And that, I just to share that with you, that you can be with water in different ways, I think. And I wouldn't say I've had an experience, but I have a terribly close affinity to those tadpoles, and I really want them to live. And it's that kind of feeling that, I'm one with those tadpoles and the frogs, that I think is so important. And I just wanted to share just another thought. Where I live in Manchester, there's huge amounts of development, and because it's driven by money, it's really hard to stop it. But I just wondered, I just had some thought that maybe we could, and we can't get the people who are developers, they're very nice human beings, but they're totally driven by money, and we can't get them to sort of save the trees. And I'm wondering if, this sort of experience might be a way in for them. And so I'm going to reflect on that, because how do we help other human beings value things like trees and birds and bees? It's really hard when there's money involved. So thank you for that. And just one final point, Peter, when the astronauts come back from space, or the cosmonauts, they also get that feeling of often that we're all one, which I love. So thank you very much, Peter.
Yeah, thank you.
The
Jean,
overview effect. Jean, you had a question.
Not exactly a question, not a question, but I've just returned from the other lot, the Wengrove and Amitav Ghosh talk, and I just wanted to feed back that what's been really interesting in light of what you've been talking about is how they've discussed vitalism. And basically Amitav Ghosh is kind of trying to say it is, it's sort of like the world is animated, it does have a voice, it is. And Wengrove is trying to say, yes, but you can have bad vitalism, look at the Egyptians and their statues, and we've got to have a socialist ecology movement, and we've got to make it useful. And it's really interesting in the light of what you've been talking about to hear the difference between kind of saying the world is, it is vital, and from the knowing of that, something emerges. Maybe it's useful, maybe it isn't, but the whole focus on agency and usefulness and the transaction that was coming from David Wengrove, and they were sort of talking across each other. So it was, I just wanted to feed that back into this conversation, where I think with an action research kind of ethic, it isn't about what's useful, it's about giving voice, it's allowing voice, and then see what happens. It doesn't have an outcome. We're not trying to save anything, or
not a direct outcome. No, I agree.
An intended outcome.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is that these kinds of experiences, I mean, some of them are quite world shattering. You don't see that. I mean, it's very easy to slip back, but you don't really experience the world any differently, and the same again. There's something So something has shifted in my experience. And of course, every time I leave the river and I go back and I get into my car, one of the things I notice is I have to put on an objective consciousness again. Otherwise, I would drive into things. But you could almost see that coming back. You can almost, maybe that's the most important learning. You know, you've been down there and, you know, the swans have flown overhead and they've done all sorts of things and you've been doing strange things by the river. And then you have to get in your car and the lights come on, or, you know, you click the switch and it goes tick, 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 and you're back into an objective and you drive back and there's all the lights of the commuters and there's that, you can almost see that shift into a different form of consciousness.
But it's the idea that people are trying to use it for something that's still human that came out of the conversation. And I did the living waters thing as with Helena too, and it did change me. It is something that happens that you don't unknow, and that's it. You know what that means. You know, for the future, we're not doing it in order to achieve something or get somewhere. It is just the truth of experience has its own truth.
Right.
I think is what you're saying. Anyway, so I just thought I'd bring that back.
Right. Well, I think we've gone over.
Right. Yeah, I'm conscious that people are gradually drifting off to service other symbionts. Helena, Jagdish, would you like to close with a few words?
Yes, I may. And Peter, thank you so much for this. And I wrote in the comment in the passing that this links up so nicely to the Indian tradition of seeing the rivers as sacred. Prayers every morning, seeing as the abode of the gods. And the Ganges is still seen as the Mother Ganges in the Indian context. And I thought there was something really beautiful in the way you put it. And I did not ask a question. I wanted the community to ask more. But one question that came up in my mind, and I'm not posing it now, but as an observation, that has it also something to do with Peter Reason, the person and his journey, and reaching a certain a range of experiences that allows you to go there? Or can a 22-year-old experience the same? Or do you think it requires a certain time and energy and reading and immersion in the experiential world to be able to do this kind of an inquiry with a river, let's say? I don't know the answer, and I wonder, and maybe we can chat up someday. Thank you so much, Peter. It is a very special day for me. You're very special to me, though you have never seen. This is just Zoom, and we have never met. And I hope someday this is going to be possible. You are the reason I really passed my masters, and I do hope some of this conversation or strands of it will continue in some way. Thank you so much, and a warm namaste from India. I'll ask Helena to close the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jagdish. And I just wanted to say as well, Peter, that I think what for me is exciting about today is this is a form of knowledge that we have been developing as community over now. You have been developing it over many decades, but the RSP, the two degrees and now ASP are developing together. And I think this is so important because we're actually building and reflecting on knowledge and learning. So I hope you feel, you've got something out of today as well, but I know that as participants, we've learned a lot. And I hope this kind of journey of learning together, that we can go on and keep doing it together. So thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you for asking me. It's always, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for participating today, even passively and listening, but it's been nice to see you all here. I'll send the recording round in the next 24 hours or so. And maybe when you receive it, if you could maybe just send a few words back on your thoughts about today, maybe what impact or what you took away from it, that would be nice so that we've got some feedback. Thanks, Helena and Jagdish, as ever, for inspiring this and keeping this going. And I know Helena's got a very short-term timescale of 10 years for our conversations. We have to achieve something within that time frame, which I love that ambition. Thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you at future meetings.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bye-bye.